And now we will have comments from Ursula Goldenbaum from Emory University.
I will skip the very first paragraphs, but I will pick up on the dramatic character which is traditionally given to the distinction. Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn it back. I will skip the beginning of the first paragraphs, and I will start with the last one. I will just pick up on this statement of Agustín that the scholastic distinction between the antecedent will and the consequential will, that is more related to a struggling between the free will and God's will, and it has a more dramatic character. And what I would just say is that in my understanding of Leibniz, it is just this dramatic or risk-taking character of the relation between God and human will, God's and human will, Leibniz eagerly tried to avoid, or at least to minimize as much as possible. Given the actual theological controversies of his time, which were well presented in this paper, and you could just see by the list of the positions Leibniz had to avoid, and that was not even complete, but what you know, that he had not just to go between Scylla and Charybdis, but between a thorny garden, which was really kind of dangerous. However, I would like to compliment a little bit more to the problems Leibniz had to face in that respect. So given the actual theological controversies of his time were presented in this paper, from supra versus intralapsarians, etc., to the respective and absolute predestination, it was precisely the metaphysical problem of human freedom versus predestination that was at the heart of all these controversies. So the immense tension between the concept of free human will in the sense of an liberum arbitrium and that of predestination, between the idea of the election of a few and the reprobation of the many versus the goodness of the loving God, between the efficiency of divine grace versus the pious life of humans who would deserve grace, was part of Christian theology since its very beginnings. Accordingly, we can look at a long history of various solutions, some approved by the respective churches, others condemned. Thus, there are plenty of dramatic and risk-taking positions, and if Leibniz had wanted to, he could have found one. When it comes to the discussion of human freedom in the 17th century, though, it is no longer restricted to theological struggles anymore. Modern science had produced a new challenge for all theological parties, particularly about the issue of freedom, and that was philosophical determinism. Although this position has been taken only by the most radical philosophers, Thomas Hobbes and Spinoza, whereas Descartes and other mechanical philosophers defended free will in the way that you can just choose arbitrarily, the inclination to determinism was built in modern mechanics and geometrical method. Of course, Leibniz strictly rejected Hobbes and Spinoza's radical determinism and was eager to save free will of humans as well as of God. Nevertheless, he wanted to keep the freedom of science as well, and that is an additional problem he has to take into the picture, into consideration. So, though he had to defend the idea of common order of nature ruled by natural laws, which we could discover to some extent, it is well known how much Leibniz was disappointed by Newton's acceptance of God's will as a sufficient cause to bring about effects in nature. If everything could be explained simply by God's will, there was no further need to ask for natural explanations. It was the arbitrariness of this voluntarism that deeply worried Leibniz. Leibniz's God does not play dice. However, modern mechanics, which would soon become the model of all other modern sciences, started with one essential principle, the principle of inertia. According to this principle, no body would move or change without being moved by another body, and no moving body would rest without being stopped by another moving body. As a consequence of this principle, no thought or will could ever move a body. Though the familiar belief we could move our body at will, so important for the explanations for human morals, but even more for the theological idea of sin, was essentially threatened. That is how this mechanical principle is of the greatest significance for 17th century metaphysics. It was at the heart of all the parallelistic approaches, I should say, like those of Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, the occasionalists. It was who denied, but also for those who denied either the minds like Hobbes or the bodies like Berkeley. The new science of mechanics itself caused a new discussion on free will, and it was rather ironic that the Protestant theological concept of predestination, this strict concept of predestination, could be used to defend determinism as it was done by Hobbes, when he said, "I'm just a good Lutheran," in his discussion with Bramhall. Leibniz, when writing about theological controversies, was well aware of these problems and engaged very clearly in the discussion on free will. He clearly wanted to save human freedom, but without giving up the regularity of the natural order as granted by God's rational, sound decrees. I would like to emphasize the impressive stubbornness Leibniz shows in all struggles to save human freedom, in holding on the natural laws of nature as its common order, and to minimize the extraordinary interventions of God. In the Theodicy, but in a more explicit way, even in a letter to Caroline of Wales, he even warns to take anything as a miracle which is not declared explicitly as such in the Bible. Although an unknown and astonishing event could well be a miracle, it could still turn out to be understandable by later scientific discoveries. Moreover, Leibniz widely uses the theological tool of explanations of natural events or human actions as tools God uses in order to reach his holy ends. Thus, it was only within these limits of a rational frame of God's decrees that human freedom could be settled by Leibniz. And that is a very huge additional challenge for him. Although a defense of human freedom within these limits seems to be a hopeless enterprise, Leibniz came up with two interesting concepts. One is his important distinction of the possibility of things in themselves versus the compossibility of a whole possible world. And that is the UCE principle, I think, you referred to, right? This provides a logical and epistemological tool for Leibniz's concept of contingency, which is not only due to the limits of our understanding, but has its own ontological status. It is something that is distinguished as well in God's understanding and paves the way for Leibniz's distinction of God's intellect and his will. It also gives way to Leibniz's distinction of necessary versus hypothetical truth. What is more important for the problem of sin, salvation, and damnation, though, is Leibniz's argument how we are responsible for our own actions, even though we are created by God with our power, conatus, as well as our limits. We as humans have the power to think. We can use it to clear up our confused or blind thoughts, making them distinct, as presented in the paper as well. So it is this activity which will increase our freedom, according to Leibniz. It is the distinct knowledge that can move us to become more active. Though the free will in Leibniz is freer when determined by distinct thoughts, Leibniz explicitly rejects the common conception of free will according to which we are able to arbitrarily choose something without any given reason. In contrast, it is activity, the effort of our rational capacity given to us by God as his sufficient grace, which is Leibniz's understanding of free human will. That is absolutely different from that what was the demand, right? It was liberum arbitrium, which was asked for. And this is the root of the whole battle between Leibnizians or Wolffians and the pietists or the anti-Wolffians throughout the first half of the 18th century in Germany. This exactly is not enough for the pietists, right? That is not free will, what Leibniz has to offer, or Wolff in his, as a successor. So I do not hesitate to admit that Leibniz's solution lacks an answer how our given capacity to be active and to reason, and how that capacity is not determined by God, thus eventually making him the only author of our action, good or bad. When Leibniz points to God's considerations of the whole creation intended to be the best of all possible worlds, he certainly has to concede that there are some individuals who cannot get as many degrees of activity as others, making them less capable to overcome sin. According to Leibniz, though, it is rather their unwillingness to become better than their lack of perfection, which makes them the subject of God's damnation, as Agustín also emphasized. But of course, isn't, according to Leibniz himself, their unwillingness a result of their lack of distinct ideas? And the distinct ideas, the lack of distinct ideas, a lack of their activity, which isn't given to them. However, he has to justify this explanation of freedom and of sin in order to keep and to defend his position that this world is the best of all possible worlds, and to solve the dilemma of its predestination, which he then declares to be a matter of fact because it has been chosen. The evil had to be admitted to get the best of all possible worlds, a greatest unity of the greatest variety. He had to defend this solution just in order to avoid traditional views of an arbitrary will in God or in humans, in order to defend the common order of nature as a product of a rationally decreeing God. However, although I'm not very much in favor to say he really solved the problem, it is obvious that Leibniz could not solve the problem for me. But this is not that interesting, as his opponents couldn't provide a solution either, as it doesn't exist, in my view. It is much more fascinating, though, that Leibniz did not follow the theological positions of his own Lutheran denominations, as Lutheran he is in many respects. And Luther provides a much more dramatic approach about free will and predestination. Whereas Newton remained completely within the theological limits of his religious upbringing, adoring God as the King and the Lord, always ready to intervene according to his hidden wills. Leibniz defends the ground for modern science as well as for religious tolerance by making God a rational and loving God who can be understood as coherent in his decrees, while not all of his single decrees can be understood by us. So we can trust in God because we know that he loves each of us and that he is a rational and in no way arbitrary and unjust being. And that is particularly clear when Leibniz says that he does not give up, that we cannot give up about any sinner in the world, and not even about any pagan or non-baptized child. It is here that he refers to a tool he seldom uses and which is much more common in Christian theology otherwise, and that is the limits of reason. Given the greatness of God's holy economy, it is not up to us to judge any sinner or any non-Christian, as it is always possible for God to produce a change of the mind in these humans by an extraordinary grace providing them with eternal salvation. Thanks.
Now Agustín will have a brief response, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Your comments are very enriching and pertinent. And I have to say that I completely agree with your form of framing the problem of free will and determinism in the context of modern science. In the middle of the extreme necessitarian and voluntaristic positions of his time, I consider that Leibniz's solution is perhaps the most reasonable. It certainly solves or attempts to solve some problems that most theologians didn't imagine. But I have decided to focus especially on the theological problem because it's a less studied aspect of